All right, ladies and gentlemen, one more time, this is Kevin Hareholtz over at Turning Technologies. I'd like to welcome you into today's session with our guest presenter, Peter DeMarco, where he's going to be discussing how to prioritize for sustained performance. Now, before we go any further off this slide, notice at the very bottom it says join the mobile session. The mobile session is where you can go ahead and respond to Peter's turning point questions that he has throughout his presentation. And you can do that by opening up a separate browser and making your way to ttpoll.com. It's going to immediately ask you for a session ID, which is simply just going to be Priority 2019, no spaces between Priority and 2019. Again, you can open up a separate browser, go ahead and join with your mobile device. But there's a lot of questions using Turning Point throughout today's presentation. We would love to have you go ahead and join in response. Now, additionally, we encourage you to go ahead and submit questions to us throughout today's presentation, and you can submit those questions using your chat or Q&A box within the GoToWebinar controls. So once I go ahead and hand over the reins to Peter to go ahead and facilitate the session, I'm going to be hanging back, responding to any questions you have about the webinar content, anything that is very specific to Peter. We're going to go ahead and aggregate those questions, and I will pose them live to Peter at the very end of the session. And then again, one more time, we are TT Poll. Session ID, Priority 2019. All right, so with no further ado, let me take this opportunity to introduce Peter. So Peter is the founder and president of Priority Thinking, where he supports his clients as an executive coach, organizational consultant, ethics facilitator, strategic advisor, helping others and their teams achieve significant performance improvements while reducing risk and embedding ethical power into decision-making at all levels. Peter also facilitates leadership and ethics education programs for organizations and business schools around the country. He was designated a top thought leader in 2014 and 2015 by Trust Across America, Trust Around the World. So Peter, again, it's so good to have you. Peter, of course, has run a number of sessions for us, and it's always a pleasure to have him on the line with us today. So Peter, right now what I'm going to do is go ahead and give you the ability to share your presentation. So I'm going to pass controls over to you at this time. And Peter, at this time, you now have the ability to go ahead and share your PowerPoint. Feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Kevin. Greetings, everyone. We're going to get started today. Our title of our webinar is Prioritizing for Sustained Performance. And let me give you a brief introduction, and then we'll get started on our topic. So our company's been around since 2003. It's our 16th year of existence. Offices in Rochester, New York, and San Antonio, Texas. So just a little bit on what we do. Kevin just took you through it. Leadership coaching, organizational development, ethics education, and it's just a little reminder on what our company does. So when I take you through this presentation with respect to priorities, I'll explain how it fits into our overall model. Okay, our history with Turning Technologies. We've actually been using them since 2007. We have over 900 hardware devices, those pollers, as well as 300 concurrent seats. And we consider ourselves power users. We very much view the technology from Turning Technologies as critical to the engagement we put on for our clients. And I'm going to demonstrate some of that today for you. A little bit about where the content's coming from today. It's all original material. So you'll see the first of my books coming out year-end, early next year, called The Goodwill Leader. The second book that follows, from which these concepts are being presented, is called Priority Thinking. And then the third book is called Power Psychology. They're all these concepts that you'll hear about today emanate from our Goodwill Leader model. So if questions at the end about how it all connects, please feel free to ask. And let's jump in. All right, so today's takeaways, or the things I would like you to gain from our webinar today. First, we're going to cover what's the nature of a priority. We'll take about 15 minutes on that. We're going to do a little bit of polling up front to get to know you. Then I'm going to introduce you to 3 types of prioritizers or priorities, and then 4 types of prioritizers that go with it. So those 4 types of prioritizers are going to take up the bulk of the presentation. I'm going to introduce you to the inverter, the absolutist, the depleter, and the optimizer. And I'm going to demonstrate some paired polling approach that Turning Technologies provides that we use a lot to help groups with setting and understanding their priorities. And then finally, some tips for sound prioritizing. So it's about 50 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then time for questions. All right, so hopefully everyone is logged on, has their session ID per what Kevin provided. And if you don't recall that, there it is, Priority 2019. Go ahead and log on, and we'll get started. So let's just begin. If you can just put in your responses, you'll notice the chart is going to update live. In Turning Technologies, I selected show the chart during the polling. So up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the number of responses coming in. Some of my charts will show the response counter. So if you want to change your response before I close, you'll just see the data will move interactively there, just demonstrating that ability. When I use Turning Technologies, I always show the charts live like this so that participants can see that their responses are actually working. Okay, everybody in? All right, we'll close the polling. And this will be one of our demographic slices we do. All right, next, the next slide is which category below reflects your organization. So if you work in a business, whether publicly traded or privately held or family business, choose 1. Nonprofit, of course, 2, and so on down the line. And if you didn't select the first question, go ahead, jump in. And we'll use this just to slice if there's any meaningful data out there. Okay, I'll close the polling. All right, now the next question, just choose 1 or 2. What role do you have in your organization? 1 for leader, 2 for individual contributor. And these first 3 questions I asked you, I'm going to use as demographic slides to help us slice the data with future slides that I'll show you. Okay, all right, an even split there. And just to show you that that is an even split, you'll notice I use the toggle response counter up here. And when you click that, it'll go from percentage to count. So that's a good way to show your audience that there's real counts underneath those percentages. All right, so now our first question for you to contemplate is where I work, my organization has 1, too many priorities, 2, too few priorities, 3, just the right amount of priorities. So go ahead, choose your perception of your organization's view of priorities. Okay, we'll close the polling. All right, common response I get is that my organization has too many priorities. And of course, the follow-on response is often if you have too many priorities, you don't have any priorities, too many things to do. Just to show you how the slicing works, I click that little cube bar up there, and then if we wanted to see male versus female, for example, you can see how the data moved. And there's male, not much difference there, but you can see the slicing will move the data. I'm going to reset the chart, and I'll just show you one more just to demonstrate. If I go down to role in the organization, I choose leader. Remember, we had a 50-50 split. That's what the leaders had to say, right? 57% said too many priorities, 14% said just right. Again, you can see the numbers will pop up there too. Now I'm going to go up and select individual contributor, and you can see the number went up almost 20 points there to 75%. So clearly the folks who are individual contributors feel like there's too many priorities, much more than the leaders do. But both groups, you can see from the data here, are showing that there's still, most organizations are struggling with too many priorities. Okay, next question. Where I work, the most negative impact on keeping sound priorities is that we waste 1, the talent we have, meaning our people, 2, the time we have, or 3, the treasure we have, as in money or resources or machines, etc. Okay, so which one do you feel is the greatest negative impact on keeping sound priorities where you work. Okay, I'm going to close the polling. Okay, 2/3 of you said time, and then 1/3 of you said talent. Typically, we'll find time and talent are the top leaders, time being number one almost all the time. So clearly, time is the one resource we can't recover. Although if we waste our people's talent, we can harm them and the organization, and they usually end up leaving. So, all right, very good. All right, next question. At this point in your life, what is your top priority? Now, all of these are priorities, of course. Number one would be your top priority is relationships, as in family, a spouse, partner, etc. Two would be money, as in making money, building up your future retirement funds, things like that. And then three would be health, meaning your well-being, perhaps losing weight, getting in shape, etc. So go ahead. All right, very good. Let's see what our response is. Okay, very interesting. Relationships. Again, this is a common theme I'll find as well, is that at the end of the day, people we're social animals, as Aristotle used to say. So we want to engage in healthy relationships with people. And yet there's a few folks over here who might have health concerns or trying to lose weight or whatever. All these are priorities that we have to manage in our life. So very good. All right, so our first topic we're going to cover is the nature of a priority. And I'm going to ask you a question. This relates to leaders in particular. All of you answer though. But why do leaders need to have priorities? So whether you're an individual contributor or a leader, just answer your perspective on why do we need to have priorities. One, order and unify a group. Two, focus the group. Or three, to execute, meaning get things done. Now, all three are good answers. So which one do you think is the primary reason that we need to have priorities? Okay, very good. Okay, a plurality of you said to order and unify a group, then followed by focus the group, and then finally to execute. Let's slice the data a little bit here, and I'm going to see what the leaders said first. Okay, so the leaders, even on order and focus, followed by execution. Individual contributors, well, we have 50% said to order and unify a group, followed by focus and execute. So let me reset that to the original one. And the answer I'd like you to think about is the first one, to order and unify a group. One of the primary functions of a leader is to bring order to something that lacks order. And the only way you can really unify a group is by bringing order to it. And to order it, you have to set priorities. So if you keep that in mind as we go through the presentation today, especially if you're a leader, is this focus on unity is critical, because leaders who do not understand what unites the group probably don't understand what can break the group. So this is very important as an ordering principle or an organizing principle for your team, your group, your department, your organization, your business, is know what holds it together. And sound priorities, especially leaders who understand how to prioritize correctly, are driving unity and order to their organization. And by the way, this is for any organization, whether it's ISIS, a Fortune 500 corporation, a church, the mafia, any organization. And I know that sounds kind of like a wide range, but all of them are held together by ordering principles. And all of those organizations, if they're going to be held together, have to have sound priorities, or at least priorities that hold them together. All right, now 3 elements of a priority I'd like you to keep in mind. First is time. You already mentioned that, and we'll talk about why that's important. Second, the importance of a particular of a priority is that something's causing you to make it a priority. It's important. There's a judgment going on. And then third, it always involves choice. So when we fail to choose, we're in a sense choosing. And when we make choices, we're prioritizing. It's just the nature of choice. So when I was growing up, my teachers or perhaps my parents might have told me I did not have my priorities straight. It was because they were able to sense how I was using my time, or what I was putting more important than perhaps school was a reflection of choices I was making. You've probably heard the same comment in your own lives. Okay. So I'd like you to think about a priority in this way. A priority establishes an order of importance or sequence for a person's or group's actions. Okay, and it requires a choice. Okay. Second, it's going to be between two competing goods. Now, I'm going to talk about this word good shortly. And then third, you have limited time. So if we had unlimited time, we really wouldn't need priorities. We'd be living in eternity. We could make all sorts of choices, and eventually everything would get done. So think about that definition as we go through today's discussion. So let's go to the word good, though, because I said a priority is a choice among two or more competing goods. What do we mean by that word good? Does it mean anything we desire and out to desire? 2, anything that fulfills a human need? Or 3, any part that helps complete a whole? Okay? Which definition for you is the best definition of the word good? Okay, I'm going to close the polling. All right, very good. The majority of you said any part that completes the whole, and that's the definition we encourage folks who work with us to think about a priority and the use of the word good. It's anything that's good is helping to move towards the wholeness or unity of that thing. And what the qualification we put on this is according to its nature. So for example, what makes for a healthy human person? If we were to talk to a doctor, he or she could describe for us all those dimensions of health, all the parts that add up to a healthy whole human person. So keep that definition in mind as we keep going. So let's get into now to the nature of choice, right? Aristotle tells us that our will, that choice power within us, is always aiming for a good, even when we choose evil. So in the moral dimension, okay, when we choose, not all of our choices, of course, are moral choices, but many of them, many more of our choices are than we realize, is we're always aiming for some good as we understand it. Okay, and Aquinas, who was a student of Aristotle, said that the will, that choice power we have, never aims at evil without an error existing in the reasoning process of the person making the choice. Now, why is this important? Because we live in times right now where we've got a lot of division, a lot of different groups with their view of what is good. And unless we understand as leaders and as followers what constitutes the right choice or the right priorities, we have to first understand that getting educated about the good is going to be important. So here's how I'd like you to think about the challenge in using the word good and how it'll affect your ability to set sound priorities. The good means that if we're properly educated in its nature of what is truly good, we'll be able to distinguish between true goods and false goods, or between a real good and one that appears to be good. Or another way of saying this is an authentic good versus a fake good. And of course, the ultimate choice we're making is between greater goods over lesser goods. So if you've ever been in a meeting with someone where they said, well, we've got to choose the lesser of two evils, they're really using that right column of a greater good over a lesser good by saying a less corrupted good over an even more corrupted good. And many times when leaders are challenged to cut their losses, it's because they have to be able to recognize the greater evil that'll result. So they have to choose the lesser of two evils. That's actually a moral choice. It's a prioritizing choice. And leaders who won't make that choice, who get overly utopian or idealistic, really don't understand the nature of all these goods that they have to make choices among. All right, so now the next portion of our presentation, I want to just briefly cover three types of priorities that you typically will encounter, right? So the first one is what I call day-to-day tactical priorities. These tend to be set by others. So if you think about all the things you have to do today, who is setting those priorities? Even when I talk to retired people, they'll tell me that, they've got grandkids to worry about, or their wife has got them running errands, or a honey-do list, or whatever it is. But if you even think about your own workday, customers, investors, your boss, even your employees, day-to-day tactical priorities are coming from them. Strategic priorities, these should be set within an organization by the leader, or if you're setting priorities in your own life, like you have a life plan or something that you want to pursue as part of your life strategy. When I'm coaching leaders, I'm first trying to find out if they have a sense of their own priorities, about their own direction in their life. So people who are the authors of their own lives are self-directed, then they should be setting their own priorities and not letting others or letting money or external factors set them for them. Well, finally, we have this one group, and this is the group we're going to focus on today, right here, core priorities. They're not set by others. They're not set by leaders or yourself. They're set by reality. Now, this is one of the distinctions I'd like you to think about in this priority thinking framework I'm introducing to you, which is most organizations view their ethics and their organizing principle as the values that they set in the organization. And I'd like to tell you that values are important, but they're actually secondary to whether you can recognize what constitutes the true, authentic, real, and greater goods that organization exists to pursue. In other words, they're not invented or created or self-defined. They're there to be discovered. They exist within the nature of things. In other words, they're set by reality. Now, let's give you an example of what I mean by that, okay? And I'm going to introduce that by showing you the four types of prioritizers, and we'll take that example of a core priority and we'll demonstrate how it works. So here's a question I typically ask people, and I've probably polled this over 20,000 times now. Both priorities are important in the rearing of children, okay? Which should a parent give the higher priority in the rearing of his or her children? Now remember, this is the parent. What should they give the higher priority? The effort that the child gives or the results that the child gets, okay? So go ahead and answer. Very good, and I'll close the polling. Okay, not surprisingly, the answers here, 76% said effort, 24% of you said results. Now, I've asked this numerous times, never telegraphed what the right answer was, and invariably, the vast majority of people choose effort over results, okay? So, why do they choose that? Well, first of all, let's look at some of the slicing just very quickly, just to see, okay? Let's see what men said over the ladies today, okay? Slightly higher here for the men. That's usually a surprise. I usually see that a little bit lower than the ladies, okay? Okay, for the women, results went up. So I'll tell you a quick story. I did this poll at a major bank, one of the top banks in the country. I was working with about 50 of their top executives. And when this question came up, it created a real debate in the room about which should be the higher priority in the rearing of children. And one very senior female executive stood up and she talked about how when she got home at night, she no longer had time to assess her kids' effort. She had to know that things were done because she was already exhausted from the day. And There was actually a tear in her eye as we went through this discussion about effort versus results, because she realized that she was more focused on the results her children were given versus the effort. So I'd like to take you through why this is an example of a good core priority for you to think about. And we're going to apply these 4 types of prioritizers that I just told you about that I'll introduce. Okay. So what happens when we invert, okay, or put results over effort in the rearing of children? Well, normally the discussion will come up is that, okay, well, as you expect just results from the child, many children will take shortcuts. They'll start to find easy ways to get you the answer you want. So the typical statistic that's cited is that cheating in grammar school even, but especially in high school, has reached an all-time high. And when children are asked why are they cheating, they say, well, I won't make it into college, or I won't make the football team, or I won't make whatever is the expectation being set. So therefore, I take these shortcuts. Invariably, though, the discussion gets into how the child is being loved based on results, meaning they're getting affirmed, etc. So good parents know that we put effort over results, but we also know that as the child gets older, we need to improve or increase the results that we're seeing. So typically when we go through this discussion, the inversion is if we expect results over effort, we're going to get some deviant behavior that will follow. However, what happens when we put effort at the expense of results? A child or a parent that says, don't worry, Johnny or Jane, just do your best. No matter how you do, it'll be fine. Well, invariably what happens is the child feels as though they're going to get congratulated no matter what. In other words, everybody gets a trophy. So we call that the absolutist parent. That's the parent that places all the focus on the child's effort, worried very much about the child's feelings, and doesn't want the child to experience failure or the friction of failure that comes with results. Okay, now obviously if the parent doesn't focus in on effort or results, okay, those parents are neglecting the child. We call child protective services in those situations. But generally speaking, what are we trying to be? We're trying to be parents that put a priority on effort over results, but we're trying to do both. In other words, we're trying to get the child to give the best effort, because we know the best effort will yield the best results. But when forced to choose, when that child has done the very best and they still only get a C, okay, then we're choosing effort over result. And we call that final type of prioritizer the optimizer parent. So let me review quickly what I just said. Okay, the inverter parent will put results over effort. The absolutist parent will just put effort at the expense of results. The depleter parent will screw them both up. They'll neglect the child. The optimizer parent is trying to do both of these priorities, but when forced to choose, they're putting effort over results. And the reason for this ultimately comes down to the fact that a child should experience the most unconditional love in life in family life. Because when they go out into the work world, they're going to experience a conditional environment. So keep that in mind, but that's an example of a core priority right there. All right, so let's review briefly again. The inverter puts that lower priority above the higher priority. The absolutist puts the higher priority at the expense of the lower priority. The depleter, they fail to act correctly on any of the priorities. Often they're just neglecting them. The optimizer, they know all the priorities, but choose the higher over the lower when they're required to choose. Okay, and the one we're going to focus on today is how to become an optimizer, but we have to learn these other types of prioritizing that are occurring, especially as it relates to core priorities, okay, because otherwise we won't be able to improve our ability to keep our priorities straight. So another way to look at this prioritizing is not just in a category, but in the way the optimizer functions, okay? So this is another chart, and I'll be sending an article to Kevin later that's called The Priorities of Getting It Right and Getting Along, in which I juxtapose those two priorities and show you how people function along this curve. So think of the optimizer as not just a condition that you're just stuck in, or I'm always an optimizer. Most of us, frankly, will invert. We'll take the easier good over the more difficult good, or we'll take the lower good over the higher good because it's just we tend to get expedient. But the optimizer is aware of all these priorities and just finding the sweet spot along this curve in which to function. So I know this is a more difficult concept in a sense to grasp, but as we go through this, hopefully you'll see that when you're putting both those priorities together and then choosing, you're optimizing in that particular situation and getting the power of good judgment from it. I'll cover these two other sub-optimizer categories called the juggler and the balancer a little bit later, but think of the juggler as having trying to do too much, and the balancer is always creating trade-offs, but they're both trying to work towards this optimizer status. So let's take an example then. A therapist, for example, would probably tend to operate down here if we were to take those two priorities I mentioned of getting it right and getting along. And they would tend to say, I want to get along with this patient, build up a trusting relationship over time so that I can eventually get it right. So those two priorities are in tension, but if the therapist is trying too quickly to get to a solution for the patient who's not ready for it, well, then the patient will resist that because it's a very careful relationship of building trust. Human resource leader might tend to be down over here, worried about the unity of the group. So they'll focus on getting along, but knowing that they eventually have to get it right. Whereas an operations manager or a CEO will probably tend to be right up here in the middle to slightly to the left along this curve, depending on the situation. Sometimes you move all the way down here. It's a judgment that's occurring. All right. So depending on your situation and your position, you'll be expected to function at various levels along this optimizer framework, or this priority frontier, as we call it. All right, so now let's take a few examples and I'll show you how this prioritizing applies. So our first example is Morgan the inverter, and I'm going to read the scenario to you. Okay, this one involves performance evaluations. Morgan's a customer service manager for Apex Industries, likes to keep his employee team of professionals happy, always tries to show how much he cares for his team. So Morgan, to avoid any conflict with and among his people, will preach constantly that a team that gets along is a team that gets ahead. Morgan knows that some of the employees on his team do not work as well or as hard as others, but he wants to keep the peace. So Morgan gives all of the employees on his team high or the highest ratings on their evaluations, regardless of their performance. Okay, so does Morgan's decision get it right? In other words, do you think he's got the right priorities by giving everybody high ratings because he places a priority on a team that gets along or works well together? Okay, so let's see your answers. Not surprisingly, the answer is no. Now, we have to look at this and say, okay, now wait a minute. Why is Morgan's decision not right? So let's analyze that so you can see how this notion of competing goods works, okay? Well, the common answer, and I'll do this on the factory floor with employees, and I'll do it right up into the boardroom, is the obvious answer is, hey, it's just not fair. Well, we got to look at why is it not fair? Well, fairness has two ethical meanings. Equality, which means treating people the same, and equity, which means treating people according to what they have earned or are due. So in this situation with Morgan, okay, in giving performance evaluations, Morgan chose the good of equality, treating people the same, over the good of equity, treating people according to what they've earned or are due. Now, why do I go to this competing goods, right? Equality and equity are two fundamental goods or principles related to fairness. The nature of a business is that we're producing a good and service at a profit, okay? And the nature of a business is that we tend to reward people on equity, meaning what the good they've done or contributed to the business. So in this situation, Morgan inverted. He put equality above equity. And this is contrary, if you think about it, contrary to the nature of a business. He inverted. And so when leaders do this, it's a sign of a bad education in a sense. They don't understand the nature of what that team should be doing for the business. However, we've got to be careful. Are there times when we want to treat everybody equally? Well, certainly there are. So one of the things I try to tell folks to keep in mind as you're exercising justice, meaning fairness, is if you want a team that's going to get it right or pursue the best performance, we also have to know, in order to be fair, we have to know what measure of mercy we provide within the organization. So think of it this way. In an organization that was just focused on being perfectly fair, we wouldn't forgive any mistakes. We'd simply punish people according to the good they did or the bad they did. But we need to put the quality of mercy into fairness. Otherwise, what happens is fairness without mercy can become cruel. We don't give people a second chance. The same thing can happen, though, when we have mercy without fairness can lead to foolishness. So this optimizing of these goods, all right, takes some real judgment. It's not going to be black and white. It's going to require judgment in the situation, involving the people and the effort they put in, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's ask the obvious question then that we asked about children. Both priorities are important. Which should an employer give the higher priority in leading adult employees? The effort that the employee gives or the results that the employee gets? Which should be the higher priority? Okay, we'll close it here in a second. Very good. Okay, now you notice that the shift, instead of 75-25 on effort results with children, now we have 88% results to 12% effort. Again, I didn't give you the answer, but you can see that you know this naturally, that the nature of employment and the employer is that we have to eventually judge adults on the results they get. Again, all right, if they're not getting the results, do we evaluate effort? We certainly do. So the following question would be, you have an employee who is not getting the results and not making any effort. What do you do? Generally, the response is we would terminate the employee. Well, okay, you have an employee that is giving you best effort but not getting the results. What would you do? Well, we would retrain them, give them a second chance, perhaps find another job where they're a fit. Because that employee's attitude, we know eventually we can find a skill set where they'll be a fit, where they'll help unify the whole. So you can see how that judgment goes into optimizing. So this is just an example of another core priority that needs to be practiced. All right, let's take a second example. And this one I'd like you to follow along. And the critical point in this example I'm going to emphasize. So this one is about tenure versus performance. Okay, at least 60% of the frontline employees at Kayak Concepts have been with the company for 5 years or more. The company is non-union, so I'm emphasizing non-union here, and all of the affected employees are paid on an hourly wage scale according to their job position. So remember, it's non-union, hourly employees, and they're paid according to their job position. Now, the company has to downsize due to a recession, let's say, okay? And Kayak Concepts decides to let people go strictly on the basis of seniority within the defined job categories without performance of work being a criterion. Several high-performing employees have less than 5 years of tenure. Everybody get that situation there, right? They're going to do a layoff, and they've announced that the layoff will be strictly on the basis of seniority within the job categories. So this is the priority choice they've made. All right, so evaluate their layoff decision criteria. Did they get it right? Did they prioritize correctly? Okay, I'm going to close the polling. Okay, 80% of you said no, 20% yes. And this is a typical response I get to this scenario. But we have to take a look at this to understand the nature of prioritizing or optimizing and what it really means to get these fundamental goods ordered correctly. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit further. Okay, why does the company's decision actually get it right? Why is that the right thing to do? 80% of you said it wasn't. Let me explain. First of all, it is fair. Now you might be saying, now how can that be fair? You're letting your better employees go over the less performing ones. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit. Okay, the company leaders are prioritizing the two principles of fairness in the right order. They're putting equality, meaning everybody's the same except for tenure, okay, as a way of having clear demarcation between who should stay and who should go when it's nobody's fault. And then they're putting equity second. Now, I chose hourly employees as this example because when you do this with sales teams and other folks, equity can come into play based on a number of factors. But the reason I'm bringing this up for your sake in understanding prioritizing is that unless you understand the principles at stake, what happens is we'll use arbitrary judgments on what performance is based on time or whatever, and ignore the equality principles at stake. So let me give you an example. I've run in my career before I was a CEO, I ran 3 production plants. One of them I built in Mexico and ran. And all of my plants were non-union. Well, actually, the one in Mexico was union, but the 2 in the US were non-union. And I always did layoffs whenever we had to do a layoff based on seniority within job position. And you can imagine my supervisors at first would complain about, hey, I'm going to lose some of my best people. So my response often was, hey, Morgan, come into my office and let's review the performance evaluations you gave on your people over the last several years. Okay. And sure enough, Morgan had rated most of his people at the high or highest ratings. And the point of this example is that most people save the tough decisions, i.e. letting people go, when layoffs come, instead of doing the day-to-day performance management required to get sustained high-performing teams in place. So I'd ask, I know this is a provocative example, but it's one meant to show that many of us think we're prioritizing correctly when in fact we may be taking the short route or the expedient route and not the route that is the right one, where we're doing the difficult good every day and making it a habit. So I'd ask you to consider that example. It's one that as I debate it with executives, they begin to realize that they're not prioritizing like they should be on a day in and day out basis with performance of their teams. Okay, so let's go and just review again. These are the 4 types of prioritizers that I mentioned, right? The inverter, okay, he's putting that lower priority at the expense of a higher priority, okay? And in the get it right or get along application, we would say they're getting along at the expense of getting it right. There's another priority pair, if you will. The absolutist would put the higher priority at the expense of the lower priority. So if we were using this priority pair of get it right versus get along, they'd be putting get it right over get along. Depleters, they don't act on any of the priorities correctly, and if we apply it to an example of getting it right or getting along, they would fail to get it right and to get along. The optimizer, they're doing all the priorities, they're working on them all, but when they're forced to choose, they're choosing the higher over the lower, meaning they get it right and get along, but when it's forced to choose, they make sure they get it right first. Okay, so how about you? Given what we just went through, what type of prioritizer do you mostly see yourself at? If you're honest with yourself about things, how would you rate yourself? 1 for inverter, 2 for absolutist, 3 for depleter, 4 for optimizer. Go ahead and choose. It's all anonymous, of course. Okay, I'm going to close the polling. Okay, 38% said inverter, 44% absolutist. Boy, this is an honest group. I commend you all. And 19% of you saw yourself as optimizers. It's very good that if you identify this, I'll tell you when I was a young leader, and you'll see this in the article we'll send out after this, I struggled with being more of an absolutist, and found out that was just that really affected my effectiveness as a leader. I'm going to take you through how I actually discovered these 4 types of prioritizers a little later, but this is a good mix here. So let's just take a quick look here and see what the ladies versus men saw. So here's, okay, the ladies are a little bit higher on the optimizer, lower on the inverter, higher on the absolutist. So let's see about the males. Wow. Gentlemen, you were quite honest here. A lot of inverters, okay, and absolutist lower. So big mix shift there. Everybody see that? One more time. There's the ladies, and there's the gentlemen. Okay. All right. Let's just one more split. Let's go look at leader versus individual contributor. This was the leaders. Okay. Good. Leaders. You can feel like an absolutist at times because you can't get your team to optimize. This is a great thing to work on. Okay. Very good. And then the individual contributors, I'm going to guess the inverters will go up. Yep, very good, that did. So individual contributors, if you feel as though you're doing what the boss wants instead of what you think is right, the optimizer is going to work through that friction a little bit. So don't be afraid of that. Give it a shot, okay? All right, very good. Let me reset this, and you'll get this presentation, by the way. Okay. And then which type of prioritizer do you become under stress or at the margin? Meaning when you're really pushed to the edge, what happens? What do you experience? So sometimes we tend to see ourselves as one way, and then under stress we'll behave a different way. So go ahead and answer. And we won't slice this data, we'll just capture this for the group. Okay, I'll close the polling. Okay, the absolutist went up, and this is a common response. One of the things we're trying to solve in the goodwill leader model was the kind of amplifying divisions within the country in which goodwill is depleting. And if you really reflect on it, part of the challenge we have within the country is both sides are taking absolutist positions and are struggling to work through compromises where they can at least get a common good in place. So if we all practice this together, we can reduce our absolutism, be more open-minded, and become more optimizers. That's the real struggle. And same thing with the inverter. If you see yourself kind of rolling in a relationship, meaning where you do what a partner wants or a friend wants and not asserting your own needs appropriately, same thing, work towards this. And for you folks that feel like you're depleted, I'm going to cover this in a second. Sometimes we just back away from conflict, we avoid it. I'll give you an example from my own life in the next example. Okay, so one more question here. If you had to choose which type of sub-optimizer you're closest to, which one applies to you in most situations? The balancer tends to be over-compromising, and the juggler tends to be over-committed. Go ahead and choose which one of those do you tend to see yourself as. Okay, we got about 4 or 5 minutes, so I'm going to cover a few more topics here, and then we'll wrap up with some questions. All right, go ahead, close the polling here shortly. Okay, typically I'll find more folks are jugglers over balancers. I would tell you the juggler, keep at it. The only way to become an optimizer, in my opinion, is you got to go through kind of juggling those balls in the air until you get it down. You're gonna drop a few, but it's the only way to kind of push yourself. For those folks of you who are over compromising, I would tell you try to work through conflict a little bit more. Don't get to the compromise too quickly. But a good one for you all to work on. Okay, now the next one I'm going to introduce you to, because we have a few more minutes, is how this prioritizing or these core priorities actually relate to a topic we call the operational excellence priorities. Now, in the priority thinking model, we've identified 30 core priorities, but frankly, there's many core priorities, meaning that they're naturally defined by reality. I'm going to take you through these quickly, and you can apply these within your organization, whether for-profit, not-for-profit, hospitals, military, you name it. All right, in alphabetical order, here they are. Delivery is a time-based priority. It means that the organization delivers the orders or services to the customer in the time frame expected. Flexibility is a cost-based priority. It means that the company's making, or the organization's making, prudent use of its resources by producing the product or service at the lowest cost possible. Quality is an expectations-based priority. It means company produces that product or service at the customer requirements for the value paid or the price paid. And then finally, safety. It's a life, health, security-based priority. It means you're protecting all the stakeholders, employees, customers, et cetera, as well as the equipment and assets of the firm, keeping it free from harm or loss. So if you were to think about this, take take a restaurant. In a restaurant, you would deliver the food on time. You'd produce it at the lowest cost, meaning you wouldn't waste food. You'd handle your labor correctly. Quality, the food tastes good. Safety, the food doesn't kill you. Okay, so I'm going to take, and this is a real power inside Turning Technologies that I like. It's called a paired comparison method. What I'm going to do is take those 4 goods of delivery, flexibility, quality, and safety, which I've listed in alphabetical order there, and I'd like you to answer which should be the higher priority. So this question is, which is the higher priority, meaning which should be, in reality, the higher priority? When you're forced to choose among safety versus quality, go ahead and choose. And I'm going to ask you this, the paired comparison method works this way, is it takes those 4 goods and it pairs them up. So if you're familiar with combinatorial methods, it's going to pair it up and we're going to get 6 pairs, and then Turning Technologies munges this together and we get a stack ranking. So it's a real powerful dimension of Turning Technologies. Okay, very good. Now we're going to go on to the next one. I'm not going to show you the results, okay? The next one is the good of safety versus delivery. So go ahead, which should be the higher priority? By the way, they're both important, we know that, but when you're forced to choose, what should be the higher priority? Okay, I'm going to close the polling. Very good. Next one, which is the higher priority? Safety versus flexibility. Flexibility, of course, is that cost-based priority, produce the product or service at the lowest marginal cost possible. Safety, of course, is health and well-being. So go ahead, choose 1 versus 2. Okay, going to close the polling. Okay, 3 more to go, so let's keep your pollers handy, okay? Quality versus delivery. Go ahead and choose. And there's 2 more after this, and then I'll show you how Turning Technologies brings this data together. Very powerful dimension of their application, okay? And we got 2 more to go. Quality versus flexibility. Go ahead and choose. Which should be the higher priority when you're forced to choose? Okay, and the final one, delivery versus flexibility. Go ahead and choose which should be the higher priority when forced to choose. Now, once I close the poll, Turning Technology is going to take all those pairs, bring them together, and create a stack rank. And this is an example of a core priority set that I teach and we work with all our clients on because it acts as a unifying principle. So watch what happens here now. Okay, I've closed the polling. Now I'm going to click again, and it's going to stack rank the data. And here's our stack ranking. So your answers were 2.7, 2, 0.7, 0.4. Everybody see that? And I'm not sure why that went all the way out there, but you can see this is the stack ranking you chose. Now, I didn't give you these answers. You chose these on your own, but this is an example of a core priority where we introduce clients to the fact that these competing goods of safety, quality, delivery, and flexibility are constantly in tension in your organization. And most employees, just like this group today, picked correctly the right sequencing. Now, your sequencing, your weighting was in this order. A perfect weighting would have been 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay? So just to give you an idea and introduce you to this, most organizations, when I go in and I survey and say, okay, what actually are the priorities around here? Well, guess what happens? Delivery or cost shoot up, and we see these inversions occurring within organizations. So the reason I say that values are secondary to these proper stack ranking of the goods is all of your organizational disturbances or dysfunction often come from inversions and absolutism setting in, primarily inversions when I do this particular example. Okay, we're almost out of time. So this is an example of what the perfect stack ranking would have been, but you got it right. You did well here with your answers here. Okay, so to wrap up, let me just give you a few things about setting priorities. First, do you know how much time is available? Do you allow yourself to get distracted or to avoid what's getting done? This is usually kind of looking at email versus getting ready for the next meeting, things like that. Do I know what makes my organization tick? All right. So I've got a little article out online called Learning How to Set Priorities. This was published, I think, in Business Journal, which you probably have around in your city. I also have articles out on Forbes that you'll find, but we'll make sure you get access to this article called Learning How to Set Priorities. All right, the next one, Avoiding the Urgency Loop. I like to quote President Eisenhower on this, and of course, many of you have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, saw that he borrowed from Eisenhower this kind of urgent versus important. So another good thing to go back and look at is the Eisenhower Matrix, if you will. Okay, and again, we'll let Kevin send this out to you. Okay, so that's a wrap for today. We'll go into questioning now. I ran a few minutes over. I apologize, but go ahead and rate today's session. I'm not going to show you the results. This is for my benefit. And then Kevin, I'll turn it back over to you for questions and comments.
Peter, do appreciate that very much. As always, fantastic session. So a lot of interaction with the audience. Much of the stuff that was asked you kind of got to later in the presentation. But one of the questions that came up a couple of times was in regards to what people say they are in terms of inverter, absolutist, depleter, optimizer. Do you find that people, their perception of themselves versus reality could be two different things?
Oh, yeah. In fact, that's a great question. I discovered these 4 prioritizers. I remember I was very proud of myself when I was a younger leader. I was a VP of Ops. I had several plants, and I came home after feeling like an optimizer all day. I hadn't named it that at the time, and my wife told me, "Hey, the kids are acting up. They've been unruly today. You need to bring order to the household." So I would, because I was tired and I had been an optimizer all day, at least in my mind, suddenly I became an absolutist, and I would yell at the kids, "Hey, quiet down, respect your mother." Well, that, of course, the kids would start crying, so then I'd feel guilty. And so then to placate my kids, I would try to give them what they wanted, so I would invert. Of course, this would upset my wife because she expected me to get the family back in order. So then I'd say the heck with it all and become a depleter. That's actually how I discovered this prioritizing framework, was examining my own tendency under stress or when I was tired. I might idealize myself one way, but in reality, other people were seeing me another way. So I guess the long-winded answer to that is a lot of deeper self-understanding comes from asking people around you, how do you see me versus how you see yourself, and then beginning to understand why they see you. Absolutism is often the one category I see the most tension forming. My boss doesn't listen to me, or leaders don't feel heard, and they feel like they have to make a decision. So it's a complex dynamic, but this will help you kind of at least get the conversation going with your colleagues and with your teams.
Very good, Peter. So we're right up to the top of the hour here. This next question seems like it might be a completely different session altogether, but it's dealing with strategies to move oneself from a depleter over to an optimizer. So again, very broad type question, and perhaps something in a future session.
Yeah, can I answer quickly, Kevin? No. Usually,
yeah, feel free, Peter.
If you're a depleter, I remember this when I was a young soldier. I went from this very idealized state to a period of cynicism. And I would tell you that if you're in a depleter state or just feeling cynical, it's usually because you've been defeated by your ideals. And the best way to kind of climb your way out of that is not to see things in black and white. Psychologists call this splitting, but to avoid this kind of splitting of seeing the world good or bad, right or wrong, and to begin to see the gradients of good. So in chapter 2 of my book, I actually get into this notion of gradients of good. You'll see this in the Goodwill Leader, but a great topic and an honest question. But if you're struggling with depletion, there is a path forward, but you got to begin to see what some people call the shades of gray. So.
Peter, again, thank you so much for that fantastic session. And everybody, thank you so much for taking an hour or so out of your day to go ahead and join us. So today's session was recorded, so you'll be receiving the recording as well as some additional resources that Peter will provide me within an email tomorrow. Please feel free to go ahead and click reply and ask any questions. If it's something very precise for Peter, I'll be sure to go ahead and forward it over to him as well. So thank you again very much, and we look forward, Peter, to a future session. Great job as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody.